Please welcome to the stage, Dr. Terry Taylor.
Who doesn't love a balloon? What kid doesn't love a balloon? I know from my experience that from Michigan to Malawi, kids love balloons. There is an insidious creature. It's a microscopic parasite called Plasmodium falciparum. Thousands can fit on the head of this pin. This parasite lives within mosquitoes, and when those mosquitoes bite people, it infects their bloodstream. And in some people, particularly young children, the parasite goes to the brain. And in a few short days, those children develop a life-threatening disease. They fall into coma and convulsions. Bright young children, gone. Just gone. This is a devilish and devious parasite. Devilish because of all the tragedy it causes, and devious because we haven't been able to figure out how it kills these children. Until now. We finally have the parasite cornered, which is good, because in the minute since I've walked onto this stage, the parasite has killed at least one child. Yes. One child dies of cerebral malaria every minute. My story of malaria in Malawi begins 28 years ago in conjunction with Professor Malcolm Molyneux. It was a local effort from the start. The Malawi Ministry of Health invited us to work on severe malaria in children, and we started working at the Queen Elizabeth Central Hospital. I've been fortunate that for the past 28 years, Michigan State University has sanctioned my living and working in Malawi for 6 straight months every year. It's important that we've been able to be embedded in the local community because we need to understand how the disease works. Imagine a mother in Malawi. Her child gets a fever. She doesn't have a thermometer, but she knows that the child's hot. And although the fever could mean malaria, children get 10 or 12 fevers a year in Malawi. Until the disease takes a dastardly turn and the child falls into coma or begins convulsing, she has no idea. And then it only gets more complicated for her. How is she going to get to the hospital? Transportation is expensive or non-existent. She has fields to plow. She has other children to look after. And when she gets to the hospital, she's unlikely to be greeted by long queues. So she has to sit patiently with her sick child on her lap, waiting for attention. The room reeks of sweat and urine. And the disease itself is terrible. If you didn't know clinical neurology, you would think that these children were possessed. They're crying, but the cries are abnormal. They're harsh, barking cries, and the bodies are contorted in odd postures. Convulsions are very common. The deaths are awful. One family was so convinced that their child had died of witchcraft that they asked us to do an autopsy. And they were relieved when we could tell them conclusively that the cause of the death was malaria. But then, what's so amazing is that if the child survives, he's better in 2 or 3 days. It's an incredible recovery if they survive. 20% of children with cerebral malaria do not survive. 500,000 children will die of this disease this year. When I think back to the beginning, I'm amazed at how much I didn't know. I would be surprised when a child died. Often the death was heralded by a mother weeping. The mother knew before we knew that the child was about to die. But as time passed and I learned about the disease, I was able to anticipate the death. But right now, for sure, a mother in Malawi is weeping. Let's talk about the parasite. The parasite, Plasmodium falciparum, is transferred to humans by the bite of the female Anopheles mosquito. Within minutes of its injection into the skin, by the bite of a female mosquito, the parasite disappears into the liver, becoming a proverbial needle in a haystack for 10 to 14 days. After that, it emerges into the bloodstream. Catching up. After that, it emerges into the bloodstream, where it exists for the rest of its life cycle in humans. Most people develop a mild illness, but a few progress on to severe disease, the subject of our study. Those people are the outliers. They do not serve the interest of the parasite because they die, and the parasite doesn't get passed back to the humans. The parasite, being a very canny and tenacious creature, has evolved the capacity to coexist. So most people who develop the disease have a mild illness, or even better for the parasite, they have no symptoms at all. It lurks quietly in those people, waiting to make its next move. But it's kids who are most susceptible because their immune systems have not yet learned how to cope with the parasite. So it's the children who are dying. About 20 years ago, we started to do autopsies in a way to work out the cause of death. When a death occurred, we would ask the family whether or not they would let us do an autopsy, and about a third agreed. We're conducting scientific studies like these in the hope of saving lives, but we always remember that these studies are built one life, one death, one heartbreak at a time. For years, we suspected that the cause of death was a process known as cerebral herniation, where the brain becomes so swollen that it's forced out of the skull, at the base of the skull, compressing the respiratory center and causing a respiratory arrest, causing the child to start breathing. And we spent 10 years doing autopsies, trying to identify the cause of death. We knew what it looked like in textbooks, and we looked hard. And we failed to find evidence of herniation. We failed to figure out the cause of death with the autopsies. In part, that's because autopsies are limited, kind of by definition, to people who die. And we had no way of comparing findings with those who survived. Another limitation of autopsies is that they are data that accrue from a single point in time, which is the moment of death, thus obviating the ability to observe a process. So we realized in 2005 that we needed neuroimaging to be able to figure out what was going on with these patients. But the problem was, there wasn't an MRI in Malawi. In fact, the closest MRI was in South Africa, and they cost about $1 million. Luckily, General Electric Healthcare donated a magnetic resonance imaging machine to Malawi, and in almost a Hollywood-like twist of fate, it arrived in Malawi on World Malaria Day in April of 2008. And then we were able to identify conclusively that the cause of death, in fact, was brain swelling. We could see on the MRI that the brains were swelling, extruding through the base of the skull, compressing the respiratory center in the brainstem, and causing a respiratory arrest in our children. So why couldn't we see that with the autopsies? It turns out that the act of opening the skull to access the brain during the autopsy relieved the pressure inside the skull, which allowed the brain to pop out, thus obliterating any trace of herniation at the base of the skull. When we saw the first patient who had undergone MRIs and gone to autopsy, and we saw the process, we realized that we'd caught Plasmodium falciparum in the act. And it was one of those moments that scientists crave but rarely experience. We were like, oh my God, we found it. We see what's happening. It was a very triumphant moment. We felt like our kind of hand-to-hand combat with the parasite had inched us a little bit closer, and I wanted to say to the parasite, ha! Never thought we'd get an MRI, did you? So without that machine, we never would have known. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and share with you an enduring, haunting image. When we have a death on the ward, there's a certain process that involves a chitenji. This is a chitenji. It's a cloth that is used for many purposes in Malawi. So women can wear them as dresses. Women can use them to carry babies on their backs. But in the moments after a death, the body of the child is moved to a side room, and the chitenji becomes a shroud. The mothers on the ward are generally there by themselves or maybe with another younger child that still requires breastfeeding. But the other mothers on the ward rally around the mother who's lost a child. And as the body's prepared for being moved to the mortuary, they comfort the mother. The body is eventually moved to the mortuary to wait for the family to come and collect it to go back home to the village. The shroud of the chitenji is covered with a white cloth that has a red cross on it. That's placed on a stretcher, and the nurse pushes the stretcher, followed by the mother, followed by the other mothers in single file. And so they move through the hallways of the hospital because our ward is about as far away from the mortuary as you can get in the hospital. And as the procession is moving, the mothers start singing in harmony, a cappella, using the same kind of call and response that we were all participating in earlier today, until they finally have delivered the body of the deceased to the mortuary. This is an insidious disease, which is why it was so important that we got the MRI to Malawi so that we could continue our efforts to unlock its mysteries. Now that we understand how the parasite is causing death, we can begin to work to prevent deaths. We're proceeding on two fronts. One is to expand rapid diagnosis and treatment, and the second is to develop new interventions to salvage the few who fall through the cracks and still develop severe disease. For the first, we can already diagnose malaria more easily. We have rapid tests that don't require microscopes, and we have very effective treatment based on an ancient Chinese remedy, Qing Hao Tzu. Most malaria endemic countries have been using combinations of artemisinin derivatives with other drugs known as ACTs since 2012. A colleague in Uganda did a study in which healthcare workers were available around the clock to investigate any fevers, any of these myriad fevers that children develop in sub-Saharan Africa. Every child with a fever was promptly tested, and if the fever was due to malaria, they were given prompt, effective treatment on the spot. And in over 5,000 person-years of observation, there were only 2 deaths. So ramping up and expanding effective treatment accompanied by diagnosis, could thwart malaria seriously. The second line of attack is a more effective intervention for children in the throes of cerebral malaria. We hope soon to start a clinical trial that will test our hypothesis that ventilators will save lives. What gives us so much hope about using ventilators is that there really are no other medical problems associated with these children. Think about people in intensive care units in this country. Blood pressures need to be kept up, kidneys need to keep functioning. None of that is a problem with these patients. All they need is help in taking a breath. How many times in the last 5 minutes have you thought, oh, it's time for me to take a breath? Probably none. But what if that question became the most important question in your life? The only thing these kids aren't doing is taking a breath. Everything else is fine. So if we could breathe for them with ventilators, if we could give the brain a break for a couple days to settle down, then in theory at least we could take them off the ventilators and they would live happily ever after. It may be that simple, which is irresistible. But what we don't know is whether or not it will work. Our hypothesis is that brains will settle down in everyone, given time, anti-malarial medications, and ventilatory support. But it's also possible that the brains of the children who die are so damaged that they won't recover, even with the support of a ventilator. I'm reminded of one of our patients, a little boy named Samson Ndolo. He was a typical cerebral malaria patient. He was part of our study, and we took MRIs of his brain every day. He arrived on a Friday. We imaged him on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Each day, we went over to the MRI building and reviewed his films with the radiologist, whose eyes got bigger and bigger every day because Samson's brain kept getting larger and larger. It was definitely large enough that it could have killed him. We could all appreciate that. On Monday, when we went to review MRIs with the radiologist, there were no new MRIs from Samson. And the radiologist turned to us, stricken, because in his mind, having seen the MRIs of the days before, the only explanation was that Samson had died, and there wasn't a need for any more MRIs. But we'd been taking care of Samson, and we knew there was another possibility. Samson was alive and well. He didn't have to go back to the MRI. We wanted to rename him Zozizwa, which is the term in the local language for miracle, because of his stunning recovery. But why did he recover against all odds? There's so much we still don't know about the brains of kids with cerebral malaria, and that's why our next trial is so important. I'm often asked, isn't this difficult? How can you do this day after day? Yeah, it's difficult, but so is life in Malawi. Everywhere you turn, there's need, and your instinct is to help everyone you can, which of course you can't. We're fortunate to have a very closely knit group of clinicians and nurses, mainly Malawians, who have been working together for a long time. So we all huddle after a death, console each other, relive the patient, think about what we could have done differently. Each death is a blow. And that's the price of working on a scourge like this. I think that if I failed to be moved by a death, that would be terrible. I wouldn't want to become that hardened. But as difficult as it is, there's hope. This is an important problem, but it's solvable. We've made tremendous strides. Malaria incidence rates have dropped over the last 15 years. There's progress, but it's not enough. Both the parasite and the mosquito can adapt quickly to the introduction of new control methods, so eradicating malaria is not going to be easy or quick. The families I work with in Malawi are often intimidated by medical terms and equipment, just as patients are here in the US. And there's a proverb I often use to kind of help people relax and ask questions The proverb is Safunsa Anadyapula. The one who didn't ask ate the wax. And the story is that a man was given a mason jar of honey with wax, beeswax in it, and he didn't know what it was, and he didn't ask anybody what it was, and he ate the wax instead of enjoying the honey. Everybody in Malawi knows this proverb, so when we finish up with a patient, then I turn to the mother and say, Palifunso, any questions? And she says, no, and then I say, Safunsa Anadyapula, and she kind of laughs, because she's a little surprised that I even know the proverb, but then she asks questions. For the last 28 years, I've been asking questions, and one question answered leads to more. It's been like peeling back the leaves of an artichoke to get to the heart of the problem. So when you hear about malaria or other diseases occurring on this scale, ask questions. These are global problems. We as a global community should be concerned, and we should want to support efforts to save these children even as we work to eradicate the disease. Ask questions. Taste the honey. Investigate. Mysteries can be deflated, and lives can be saved. Thank you.